Welcome to Forbidden Love Story Channel. Today we dive into a Texas night where one glance at a barbecue sparks a forbidden flame. A secret flares, torching a marriage with lies and longing. How does it rage so wild? And what's left in the ashes? Stick around. This raw tale of desire, betrayal, and redemption will grip you tight. Don't miss it. Oh. The air felt thick and syrupy as we rolled up to Mom's sprawling ranch-style house in suburban Austin, Texas. I was 32, clinging to the frayed edges of a life I'd built with my husband, Daniel, who sat beside me in the car, oblivious as ever. My pulse hammered in my chest, a restless drumbeat I couldn't quite place, though I masked it with a tight smile. At first glance, everything shimmered with the deceptive calm of a late summer evening. The cedar fence looming tall, the drooping marigolds Mom hadn't tended in weeks, the sharp tang of freshly mowed grass slicing through the humid breeze. I gripped Daniel's hand harder than I meant to as we lingered on the doorstep, the faded welcome mat beneath us curling at the edges like a warning. Another family barbecue, another ritual of forced cheer. But something gnawed at me, a dull ache swelling into a ringing dread I couldn't shake. "You okay, Ellie?" Daniel murmured, his sandy hair catching the porch light as he tilted his head toward me. His voice was warm, steady, the kind of tone that usually anchored me. I nodded, too quick, too brittle. "Yeah, of course," I lied, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. It was just a house, just another night of paper plates and small talk. But inside, something churned, wild, restless, like a glass of water jolted from its stillness, rippling out of control. Daniel didn't notice. He never did. His eyes skimmed the surface of things, content with the ordinary, while I'd always craved someone who could peer deeper, who could unravel the knots I buried beneath my skin. We stepped inside, and the clamour of familiar voices swallowed us whole, wrapping around me like a suffocating quilt. Mum flitted through the kitchen, her laugh bright and brittle as she juggled trays of sliders and iced tea glasses, her silver-streaked hair bouncing with every hurried step. It was all so achingly normal, so predictable, that I longed to dissolve into it, to let the routine dull the sharp edges of my unease. But I couldn't. Something anchored me in place, heavy and unyielding, pinning me to the hardwood floor. And then I saw him, James, standing by the wide bay window at the far end of the living room, cradling a tumbler of bourbon in his calloused hand. He was 45, rugged and weathered 45, with a quiet intensity that seemed to root him to the house itself, as if he'd grown out of the oak floors and plastered walls. But he didn't belong here. Not really. Not in the way Mom thought he did. He'd married her 2 years ago, a whirlwind decision that still felt like a jagged tear in the fabric of our family. We'd barely crossed paths since, but every rare encounter jolted me, like a shock of cold water I couldn't brace for. His hazel eyes lifted, snagging mine across the room, and the air shifted, tilted, like a key twisting in a rusted lock, unearthing something I'd buried deep. My chest seized, a frantic bird battering against its cage, and I scrambled to steady myself. "Just a family dinner," I chanted silently. Nothing more, but James stared at me like he knew, like we both did, and the ground beneath me quivered. Daniel was chattering beside me, his laugh a distant hum as he clapped some cousin on the back, oblivious to the storm brewing in my veins. I nodded, smiled, my lips stiff and mechanical, but his words blurred into static. James moved closer, his steps deliberate, inevitable, like a tide I couldn't outrun. Daniel didn't notice, he never noticed, and I hated him for it, just a little, in that fractured moment. "Hello, Ellie," James said, his voice low and steady, but there was a thread beneath it, a taut vibration no one else would catch. My heart lurched, a wild thing clawing to escape. "Hello, James," I managed, the name sharp and forbidden on my tongue, like a splinter I couldn't pull free. Daniel nodded at him, cheerful and clueless, before drifting off to refill his plate, leaving us stranded in a shrinking world of our own. James stood too close, his presence thick and electric, crackling against my skin. Time hadn't dulled him, hadn't dulled us, and I felt it, that invisible tether tightening around my throat. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a hushed rumble, each syllable sinking into me like a stone. My breath hitched, and I fought to keep my face blank, indifferent. "Thank you," I replied, the words flat, futile. I knew he saw through me, through the flimsy armor I'd patched together. Something pulsed between us, unspoken but alive, a current I couldn't outrun. I dropped my gaze, staring at the scuffed toes of my boots, but his eyes burned into me, relentless, peeling back every layer I'd tried to hide. "How are you?" he pressed, his tone careful, probing, like he was testing the frayed edges of a boundary we both knew too well. "I'm fine," I said, automatic, hollow, but inside, I was anything but fine. Tension coiled tight, guilt gnawed at my ribs, and a reckless part of me screamed to bolt, to flee this room, this moment, while another part, darker and hungrier, ached to stay, to see what might unravel. Daniel drifted back into view, laughing with Mom near the grill, and James stepped closer still, not touching, but near enough that his warmth licked at me, threatening to spark something I couldn't douse. My thoughts spun, frantic, searching for an escape, but my feet stayed rooted, traitors to my will. "We haven't talked in a while," he murmured, so soft it was almost a secret, meant only for me. His breath brushed my ear, and a shiver raced down my spine, electric and damning. "Yeah, it's been a while," I echoed, my voice trembling, a fragile thing about to snap. So much hung between us. Years of silence, buried glances, feelings we'd never dared name. I clung to my composure, but it was crumbling, sand slipping through my fingers. James looked at me, his gaze heavy with everything we'd left unsaid, and I saw it, the past we couldn't outrun, glinting in his eyes like a blade. Laughter swelled around us, the room buzzing with life, but it all faded to a dull roar. This wasn't just another barbecue. This was the spark of something vast, something treacherous, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it would shred my peace to ribbons before it was done. The days after that barbecue stretched taut and restless, each one a thread pulling tighter around my heart. I moved through life like a ghost, smiling at Daniel over breakfast, nodding at his stories about work, but inside, I was unraveling. James lingered in my mind like smoke, curling into every quiet corner, impossible to banish. His voice, that low murmur by the window, replayed in my skull, insistent, intoxicating. I hated myself for it, for the way my pulse quickened at the thought of him, but I couldn't stop. Something had shifted that night, a crack splintering through the life I'd so carefully built, and I felt it widening with every breath. It was a muggy Thursday afternoon when it happened, the moment I'd feared and craved in equal measure. Mum had roped me into running errands for her next barbecue, a casual request that felt harmless enough. Daniel was buried in deadlines at his office downtown, as usual, leaving me free to slip away. I didn't expect her to suggest James tag along. "He's got the truck," she'd said, her tone breezy, oblivious to the way my stomach lurched. I nodded, numb, unable to conjure a refusal that wouldn't sound hollow. So there I was, sitting rigid in the passenger seat of his beat-up Ford, the Texas sun glaring through the windshield, turning the cab into a furnace of stifling heat and unspoken tension. James drove with that steady confidence I'd always noticed, his hands firm on the wheel, his jaw set beneath a shadow of stubble. I stared out the window, watching strip malls and gas stations blur past in a haze of neon and concrete, willing myself to stay silent. But the quiet between us roared, deafening, pressing against my ribs until I thought they'd crack. He broke it first, his voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "How's everything going?" he asked. Casual but edged with something heavier, something that made my skin prickle. "Fine," I replied, too sharp, too quick. The lie tasted bitter, coating my tongue. Nothing was fine, not the way my thoughts tangled around him, not the way my chest tightened every time his eyes flicked toward me. He nodded, a short jerk of his head, but I caught it, that fleeting glance, piercing and knowing, stripping me bare. It was the kind of look that saw too much, that unearthed the secrets I'd buried beneath layers of routine and denial. Catch Viet content. Daniel works late a lot, doesn't he? He said next, his tone softer now, probing, like he was testing the waters of a river he knew ran deep. There was a jab in it, subtle but pointed, and it stung. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay even. Yeah, he's always swamped, I said, but the words felt flimsy, fragile, like they might shatter if I pressed too hard. Talking about Daniel suddenly felt like walking on glass, every step cutting deeper into the guilt I carried. It's tough, James said, his eyes fixed on the road, but his voice dipped, laced with an understanding that made my throat tighten. I get it. He didn't look at me, but I felt him, felt the weight of his words, the way they sank into me, exposing everything I'd tried to hide. We both knew what he meant, what simmered beneath the small talk, but neither of us dared name it. We pulled into the parking lot of the H-E-B grocery store, the asphalt shimmering with heat, the world outside unchanged, bright signs, bustling shoppers, the hum of normalcy. But inside me, everything twisted, warped, like a kaleidoscope spinning out of control. I couldn't just grab hamburger buns and pretend this was ordinary. Something loomed between us, thick and heavy, a fog I couldn't see through but couldn't ignore. We climbed out of the truck, and I hurried ahead, clutching Mum's crumpled shopping list like a lifeline, desperate to put space between us. But James kept pace effortlessly, his strides long and sure, closing the gap I tried to carve out. The air around him pulsed, charged, every step laced with a tension that coiled tighter with each breath. You know, he said as we passed a storefront, his voice low, deliberate, the last time we were together like this, things were different. He didn't look at me, his gaze locked on a display of lawn chairs, but I felt the weight of it, the way it landed like a stone in my gut. Different, I echoed, my voice trembling, unsteady. Different how? Different before the glances that lingered too long, before the silences that screamed. A wave of unease crashed over me, cold and relentless, dragging me under. Yeah, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, sharp with subtext. We've both changed. He wasn't talking about time or grey hairs. He meant us, the thing growing between us, wild and untamed. My words snagged in my throat, choked by the storm swirling inside me. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't heard, but my mind raged, a tempest I couldn't quiet. Inside the store, I grabbed a cart, shoving it forward like a shield, focusing on carrots and ketchup, anything to anchor me. James followed, calm as ever, tossing items in with a nonchalance that felt like a mask. We bantered about trivial things, but every word crackled, every glance smouldered, hiding the truth we both felt. You happy? He asked suddenly, leaning close as I reached for a bag of potatoes. His voice was a whisper, soft but lethal, cutting straight to my core. With Daniel, he added, his eyes steady, unflinching, pinning me in place. I froze, my hand hovering mid-air, the question a dagger twisting in my chest. Happy? Was I? The answer clawed at me, raw and jagged, but I couldn't face it, not here, not with him watching. Yeah, of course, I lied, my voice brittle, cracking under the strain. But he saw it, the flicker of doubt, the fire I'd tried to smother. He pulled back, smiling faintly, but his eyes darkened, shadowed with a knowing that made my stomach drop. He didn't believe me, he knew. And in that moment, I knew too, I wasn't happy, hadn't been for longer than I could admit. Not with Daniel, not with the life I'd trapped myself in. We finished the shopping, the cart rattling as we pushed it to the truck, but the air between us thickened, heavy with everything unsaid. Every step back to the cab felt like a march towards something inevitable, something I couldn't outrun. I climbed in, my hands trembling, and as James started the engine, I felt it, the shift, the pull, the line we were teetering on. This wasn't just a grocery run, this was the beginning of a fall I couldn't stop. The grocery run had cracked something open inside me, a fissure I couldn't seal shut no matter how hard I tried. That kiss in James's truck, brief, reckless, searing, had branded itself into my skin, a mark I couldn't scrub away. It wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was a confession, a truth we'd both known but never dared voice. I'd crossed a line, and the world I'd built with Daniel felt like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff, ready to plunge into the abyss. Yet, instead of pulling back, I leaned in, drawn to James like a moth to a flame, knowing full well it would burn me alive. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of stolen glances and whispered lies. I told myself I could stop, that I'd bury it, shove it down deep where it couldn't touch me. But every time I saw James, at Mom's house, in passing at the hardware store, even in the flicker of my own restless dreams, the pull grew stronger, fiercer, a current dragging me under. We didn't talk about it, not at first. We pretended, danced around it with forced smiles and small talk, but the air between us crackled, electric and alive, a secret pulsing beneath every word. It started small, innocent enough to fool myself. A text here, a quick call there, James checking in about Mom's next gathering, me replying with a casualness that felt like a mask. But the messages stretched longer, the calls grew quieter, heavier, until one evening he said it. "Meet me," just to talk. His voice was low, rough, laced with a hunger that mirrored the ache gnawing at my chest. He'd rented a small apartment across town, a temporary place for a work project, he said. No one would know, no one would see. I should have said no. I should have deleted his number, turned off my phone, run back to Daniel and the life I'd promised to keep. But I didn't. I couldn't. I told Daniel I had a late shift at the boutique, a lie that slipped out too easily, tasting sour on my tongue. He nodded, distracted by his laptop, his trust in me a knife twisting deeper into my guilt. The drive to James's place felt endless, the Austin skyline fading into a smear of lights as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The apartment was tucked off a quiet street, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering porch light. I stood outside his door, the humid night pressing against me, thick and suffocating, my breath shallow and ragged. This was wrong, every fibre of me screamed it, but my hand lifted, trembling, and knocked anyway. James opened the door, and the sight of him hit me like a punch. His dark hair mussed, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. "Hi," he said, soft, tentative, like he was afraid I'd bolt. "Hi," I echoed, my voice a fragile thread, barely holding together. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me, sealing us into a world that felt separate, unreal, a bubble where the rules didn't apply. The apartment was sparse, bare walls, a sagging couch, a coffee table littered with takeout containers. Temporary, impermanent, just like us. But it was ours, a refuge carved out of the chaos, a place where I could shed the weight of who I was supposed to be. We sat on the couch, the silence stretching taut between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said. My hands fidgeted in my lap, restless, while James watched me, his gaze steady, searching. "I've been thinking about it," he said finally, his voice rough, raw. "About what happened?" "So have I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. My chest tightened, a vice of guilt and longing squeezing the life out of me. I knew what he meant, that kiss, that moment when we'd let the dam break. It wasn't a mistake, not in the way I wanted it to be. It was real, terrifyingly real, and it pulled at me with a force I couldn't fight. "We have to be careful," he said, leaning closer, his breath warm against my cheek. No one can know. His words were a vow, a plea, and I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Of course no one could know, not Daniel, not Mom, not the world that would judge us and tear us apart. But even as I agreed, I wondered how long I could keep this buried, how long I could live split in two. That night, we didn't stop at talking. His hand brushed mine, tentative at first, then firm, pulling me toward him with a desperation that matched my own. I fell into him, into the heat of his touch, the roughness of his skin, the way his lips claimed mine with a ferocity that drowned out every rational thought. It was wrong. God, it was so wrong, but it felt like the only thing that made sense, the only thing that filled the hollow ache I'd carried for too long. We crossed every line, shattered every boundary. And when it was over, I lay there in the dim light of his apartment, my breath ragged, my body trembling, knowing I'd never be the same. The meetings became regular, a rhythm I couldn't break. I'd slip away when Daniel was at work, weaving excuses, late nights at the store, drinks with friends, that grew flimsier with every telling. James's apartment became my escape, a sanctuary where I could breathe, where I could be the Ellie I'd hidden beneath layers of duty and pretense. Each time I walked through that door, I saw him differently. Not just the man Mom had married, not just a familiar face from family dinners, but the one who'd rewritten my world. His touch was a drug, his voice a lifeline, and I was addicted, spiraling deeper with every stolen moment. But the cracks were spreading. Daniel started to notice. Small things at first, the way I'd flinch when he touched me, the way my eyes darted away when he asked about my day. "You're different," he'd say, his voice soft but edged with worry, and I'd brush it off, blaming work, exhaustion, anything to keep him from digging deeper. The lies piled up, heavy and jagged, a wall between us I couldn't dismantle. James and I planned every encounter with precision, times when Daniel was buried in meetings, when Mum was out of town. But the secrecy was a weight, pressing harder with each passing day. I'd come home to Daniel after those nights, my skin still tingling with James's touch, my heart a tangled mess of guilt and yearning. I'd slide into bed beside him, staring at the ceiling while he slept, his breathing steady, trusting, oblivious. I hated myself, hated the liar I'd become, hated the way I'd let this thing with James consume me. But I couldn't stop. It was too late to turn back, too late to pretend I didn't feel it, the pull, the need, the reckless thrill of something I knew would destroy me. We were diving headfirst into this, James and I, as if it could save us from the lives we'd outgrown. Each meeting pushed us further. Each touch erased another piece of who I'd been. I saw it in his eyes too, the guilt, the longing, the fear that this couldn't last. We never said it, never admitted how far we'd fallen, but it hung there, a shadow we couldn't outrun. I was losing myself, piece by piece, and yet I clung to him, to this secret, like it was the only thing keeping me afloat. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, and I knew, deep down, in the quiet moments when the world stilled, that it would break us all before it was done. The air in our house had turned brittle, sharp-edged, like it could slice me open if I moved too fast. I'd been living on borrowed time, balancing lies with a precision that left me hollow, but the cracks were widening, and I felt them splintering beneath my feet. Daniel wasn't the same anymore, not the easygoing man who'd once trusted me without question. His eyes, once warm and steady, now flickered with something darker, something searching, and every glance he threw my way tightened the knot of dread in my gut. I'd woven a web of excuses, late nights, errands, exhaustion, but the threads were fraying, and I could feel him tugging at them, testing how much they'd hold. It started subtly, a shift I could have dismissed if I weren't so hyper-aware, so paranoid. He'd ask about my day with a casualness that felt forced, his voice too even, his gaze lingering a beat too long when I answered. "How was work?" he'd say, flipping through papers at the kitchen table, but his fingers would pause, hovering over the page, waiting for me to trip over my words. I'd smile, bright and brittle, and spin another half-truth, busy customers, a shipment delay, while my heart thudded against my ribs, loud enough I swore he could hear it. He'd nod, but the air between us thickened, heavy with unspoken questions he wasn't ready to ask. The tension coiled tighter with every meeting I stole with James. I'd come home from his apartment, my skin still humming with his touch, my mind a storm of guilt and exhilaration. And Daniel would be there, watching. Not accusing, not yet, but observing, like he was piecing together a puzzle I'd scattered across our life. I'd catch him staring as I kicked off my shoes, my hands fumbling with my bag, and I'd force a laugh, a quick, long day, to fill the silence. But his eyes narrowed, sharp and probing, and I'd turn away, my stomach churning, praying he couldn't see the truth etched into every nervous twitch. It all came to a head one humid Saturday evening, the kind where the Texas heat clung to everything, sticky and oppressive. Mum had asked James to swing by our place, something about picking up old tax files she'd left in our garage, a mundane errand that shouldn't have mattered. But the moment I heard his truck rumble into the driveway, my chest seized, a cold sweat prickling down my spine. This was dangerous, too close, too real. James in our house, with Daniel right there, felt like a lit match hovering over gasoline. I stood frozen in the kitchen, gripping the counter, willing myself to breathe as the doorbell chimed. Daniel glanced up from his desk in the living room, his brow furrowing as he set down his pen. "Who's that?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with a curiosity that made my mouth go dry. "James," I said, too fast, my voice wobbling. "Mum sent him for some stuff." He nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. And I saw it. A spark of something hard, something wary, igniting behind his calm. James stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable. He nodded at Daniel, his voice steady as always. "Hey, man," he said, jingling his keys. Casual, unruffled. But I knew him too well, knew the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened beneath his flannel shirt. Our eyes met for a split second, a fleeting collision that sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric. I looked away, fast, my pulse racing, but the damage was done. Daniel's gaze darted between us, quick and cutting, and I felt the air shift, heavy with a suspicion I couldn't outrun. "Hey," Daniel replied, standing slowly, his movements deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. His voice was too smooth, too controlled, and it chilled me to the bone. "Everything all right?" The question hung there, deceptively simple, but it wasn't aimed at James. It was for me. I hesitated, my tongue thick, my mind scrambling for a lifeline. "Yeah, of course," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Just tired." But my words sounded thin, desperate, and I knew he heard it, the tremor, the lie. James shifted, pulling the conversation toward the errand, his tone light as he mentioned the files. I clung to his words, grateful for the distraction. But Daniel didn't move. He stayed rooted by his desk, arms crossed, his eyes tracking us like a hawk. The room pulsed with tension, a silent scream I couldn't muffle. When James brushed past me to head for the garage, his arm grazed mine. Accidental, fleeting, but it was enough. Daniel's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his skin, and I knew he'd seen it, felt it, the invisible thread tying me to James. "Picking up some papers for your mom, huh?" Daniel said suddenly, his voice loud in the quiet, almost playful but edged with something colder. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on James, then sliding to me, slow and deliberate. "You've been around a lot lately. Didn't used to drop by this much." The words were a jab, sharp and probing, and my breath caught, a ragged gasp I couldn't hide. "There's been a lot going on," James replied, his smirk faint but steady, deflecting with an ease I envied. But I felt it, The strain in his voice, the way his calm was a fragile shell. Daniel's gaze didn't waver, pinning me in place, and I saw the doubt flicker there, hardening into something solid, something I couldn't wish away. "Ellie," he said, turning to me, his tone shifting, softer but loaded. "Why are you so tense? You've been jumpy since he walked in." The question hit me like a slap, direct and unrelenting, and I froze, my blood turning to ice. My face betrayed me. I felt it, the way my eyes widened, my lips parted with no sound. James stiffened beside me, a statue carved from the same panic choking me, but he didn't speak. "Daniel, what's that supposed to mean?" I managed, my voice too high, too defensive. "I'm fine, just tired, okay?" But the lie crumbled as it left my mouth, and his frown deepened, his eyes boring into mine, searching for the truth I'd buried too deep. He stepped back, but the tension didn't break. It thickened, suffocating, wrapping around us like a noose. James grabbed the files and muttered a quick goodbye, his boots heavy on the hardwood as he left. The door clicked shut, and I felt Daniel's stare before I even turned. He stood by the window, arms still crossed, his silhouette rigid against the fading light. "You're nervous," he said when I shuffled back into the room, his voice quiet but threaded with steel. "What's going on?" "I'm just tired," I repeated, clinging to the excuse like a lifeline, but it sounded pathetic, flimsy. My hands twisted together, betraying me, and I forced them still, my chest tight with fear. "Ellie, I'm not dumb," he said, slow, deliberate, each word a hammer driving nails into my resolve. "Something's off. Too many coincidences." His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw it, the hurt, the suspicion, the storm brewing behind his calm. My throat closed, panic clawing up my spine, and I scrambled for a defense, anything to push him back. "You're imagining things," I said, my voice shaking, weak. It was all I had left, a desperate plea to keep the facade intact. He tilted his head, studying me, and for a moment I thought he'd press harder, tear it all down. But he didn't. "Maybe," he said finally, his tone flat, testing, "but if I'm wrong, the truth'll come out eventually." The words landed like a threat, cold and final, and I stood there, rooted, as the rain started tapping against the glass. A steady, relentless rhythm that mirrored the dread pooling in my veins. He turned away, back to his papers, but the silence screamed louder than any accusation. I dodged it, for now, but I knew this was just the beginning. The truth was rising, unstoppable, and it would drown me before it was over. The rain battered my windshield, a relentless drumbeat that echoed the chaos thrashing inside me. I sat in my car, parked outside James's apartment, the engine off, the world blurred beyond the streaked glass. My hands gripped the steering wheel, trembling, slick with sweat despite the damp chill seeping through the cracks. I'd been spiraling for weeks, caught in a riptide of guilt and longing, but tonight was different. Tonight, I'd come to end it, to sever the thread that had tangled my life into knots I couldn't unravel. The affair had started as a wildfire, fierce and consuming, but now it was choking me, strangling everything I'd once held dear. I had to stop it, I had to. Every breath felt heavy, laboured, as I stared at the flickering porch light above his door. The memory of Daniel's eyes, sharp, wounded, suspicious, haunted me, a ghost I couldn't shake. He was onto me, closer than ever, and the lies I'd spun were crumbling, fragile as ash in my hands. I couldn't keep living this way, split between two worlds, drowning in a secret that was tearing me apart. James had become my refuge, my ruin, and I hated how much I still craved him, his touch, his voice, the way he saw me when no one else did. But this wasn't love. It was destruction, and I couldn't let it burn any longer. I exhaled, a shaky gust that fogged the window, and forced myself out of the car. The rain stung my skin, cold and biting, soaking through my jacket as I trudged toward his door. Each step sank like lead, heavy with inevitability, But I kept moving, driven by a resolve that felt brittle, ready to snap. This had to end, tonight, before I lost everything. The door loomed ahead, chipped paint and faded numbers mocking me, and I knocked, my fist trembling against the wood. James opened it fast, like he'd been waiting, his face softening into a smile that faltered the second he saw me. "Ellie," he said, his voice warm, concerned, slicing through me like a blade. "What's wrong?" His eyes searched mine, steady and piercing, and I felt my chest tighten, a vice of pain and regret. He looked at me with that care, that depth, the kind that had pulled me in from the start, and it made this so much harder. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside, my words sharp, final, like a judge's gavel. His apartment smelled of coffee and leather, a familiar comfort that twisted the knife deeper. He closed the door, the click loud in the silence, and moved closer, his brows knitting with worry. "About what?" he asked, his tone thick, unsteady, like he could sense the storm brewing in me. I stood there, dripping wet, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The words clawed at my throat, desperate to escape. But they hurt. God, they hurt. "James, we have to stop," I said, forcing my voice to hold firm, though it quivered at the edges. "I can't do this anymore. We can't keep going." Each syllable cut, raw and jagged, tearing at the fragile thing we'd built. He froze, his eyes widening, shock rippling across his face like a crack in glass. "Stop," he repeated, his voice trembling, hoarse as he stepped closer. "Ellie, are you serious?" His hand reached for mine, instinctive, pleading, but I pulled back, the distance a chasm I couldn't let him cross. "Yes," I said, my gaze dropping to the floor, unable to bear the pain in his eyes. "I'm serious. It's killing me. It's ruining everything. Daniel's starting to figure it out. And My voice broke, a sob I swallowed hard. "I can't keep doing this to him, to us, to myself." The truth spilled out, bitter and unfiltered, a confession I'd delayed too long. "Ellie, listen," he said, his voice rising, desperate, as he grabbed my hand again, his touch warm, heavy, anchoring me when I wanted to drift away. "You can't just walk away like it's nothing. What we have, it's real. This isn't a mistake. It's not some fling." His words slammed into me, fierce and raw, shaking the resolve I'd clung to. He believed it, believed in us, and that made it worse because part of me wanted to believe it too. "It doesn't matter," I said, wrenching my hand free, the loss of his warmth a fresh wound. "I'm married, James. We don't have a future. This, whatever it is, it's only breaking everything I've got. I can't betray Daniel any more than I already have." My voice cracked, guilt flooding me, drowning me. I saw the wreckage in my mind, Daniel's trust, our home, the life I'd vowed to protect, all crumbling because of me. He stared at me, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with a mix of hurt and defiance. "Do you love him?" he asked suddenly, the question a dagger, sharp and bitter, slicing through the air. It stopped me cold, my breath hitching as I fumbled for an answer. Did I love Daniel? I had once, fiercely, simply, but now. The feeling had faded, overshadowed by James, by this reckless pull I couldn't escape. Was it love or just duty, a habit I couldn't break? "It doesn't matter," I said finally, dodging the truth because I didn't know it myself. "What matters is I have to choose my family. It's the only right thing left." The words felt hollow, a script I recited to convince myself, but they were all I had. James's face twisted, pain etching deep lines into his features, and I wanted to take it back, to erase the hurt I'd caused. But I couldn't. "So this was all for nothing?" he rasped, his voice breaking, a desperate edge cutting through. "Everything we felt, just a mistake." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms to keep from crumbling. "It's not a mistake," I said, my eyes stinging, tears threatening to spill, "but it has to end." I took a step back, the space between us growing, cold and unbridgeable. He let go of me then, his hands falling limp, and the silence that followed roared, deafening, final. "I understand," he said at last, his voice soft, resigned, the fight draining out of him. His eyes dimmed, the hope I'd seen there snuffed out, and I felt it. The end, sharp and absolute. We stood there, the rain drumming outside, a mournful backdrop to the wreckage of us. I turned, my legs leaden, and walked out, the door closing with a thud that echoed in my bones. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled back to the car, the rain washing them away. But I knew I'd done it. It was over. Now I had to face what came next. Daniel, the truth, the life I'd nearly lost. I'd made my choice, and it was right, even if it shattered me. The drive home from James's apartment stretched into an eternity, each mile a heavy chain dragging me toward a reckoning I couldn't escape. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, a faint patter against the windshield, but inside me, a tempest raged, wild, unrelenting, tearing at the fragile walls I'd built. My hands shook on the steering wheel, my breath shallow and ragged, as the truth clawed its way up my throat. I couldn't keep it buried any longer. The lies, the guilt, the weight of what I'd done with James. It was suffocating me, a noose tightening with every heartbeat. I had to tell Daniel, tonight. No matter how much it would break us, I couldn't live in this shadow anymore. Our house loomed ahead, a familiar silhouette against the dim streetlights, white siding, neatly trimmed shrubs, the porch light glowing like a beacon I didn't deserve. I sat in the car, engine off, staring at the windows where soft light spilled out, my chest tight with a dread so thick it choked me. How had I let it come to this? How had I betrayed him? Daniel, the man who'd loved me, trusted me, built a life with me? My fingers curled into fists, nails biting into my palms, and I forced myself out, the air cool and damp against my tear-streaked face. Each step up the walkway felt like a march to my own execution, but I kept going. The truth was the only way out, even if it razed everything to the ground. I stepped inside, the quiet hum of the house wrapping around me, too normal, too calm, a cruel contrast to the storm inside. Daniel sat in the living room, hunched over a stack of papers, his glasses slipping down his nose, his focus unbroken until I spoke. "Daniel," I said, my voice a frail whisper, trembling in the doorway. "We need to talk." He looked up, his expression shifting from distracted to alert, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He set the papers down, slow and deliberate, and I saw it. The suspicion he'd carried for weeks, rising to the surface, ready to meet whatever I'd brought home. "Did something happen?" he asked, his tone careful, attentive, like he was bracing for a blow he didn't yet understand. I moved closer. Sitting across from him on the edge of the couch, my hands twisting together, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The words stuck, sharp and jagged, but I forced them out, knowing there was no turning back. "I've done something terrible," I said, my voice barely audible, a confession that sliced me open as it left my lips. His face stilled, a mask of calm hiding the storm I knew was coming. "What exactly did you do?" he asked, his voice cold, quiet, a thread of tension weaving through it. I took a breath, deep and shaky, and let it spill, the truth, raw and unfiltered, a wound I couldn't bandage. "I had an affair," I said, the words echoing in the silence, heavy as lead. "With James." The room seemed to tilt, time slowing as the weight of it landed. Daniel stared at me, his eyes wide, uncomprehending, like he couldn't process the betrayal I'd just laid bare. I pressed on, my voice breaking. "It went on for a while. I don't know how it happened, but I can't keep lying. I'm so sorry." Each word was a hammer, smashing the fragile peace we'd clung to, and I watched him fracture before me. He was silent, too long, his gaze locked on mine, and I saw the shift. Disbelief hardening into something darker, something feral. "What?" he rasped, his voice hoarse, like the word had been ripped from him. He stood slow, unsteady, his hands clenching at his sides. "You slept with James?" "My friend," the accusation roared, fury igniting in his eyes, and I flinched, the force of it slamming into me like a tidal wave. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. But it was useless, a feeble shield against the rage I'd unleashed. He stepped closer, his face contorted, his breathing heavy and jagged. "How could you?" he shouted, his voice rising, cracking with pain. "How could you do this to me, to us, to everything we had?" The questions rained down, sharp and merciless, and I had no answers. No defense, just guilt, thick and choking, drowning me in its depths. "I didn't mean," I started, but he cut me off, his hand slashing through the air. "No!" he yelled, louder, the sound reverberating off the walls. "You betrayed me. You destroyed it all. Get out. I don't want to see you. Get out of my house." His words were a verdict, final and brutal, and I saw the love in his eyes die, replaced by a cold, unyielding hate. He loomed over me, a stranger now, his chest heaving, his fists trembling with barely contained fury. "Daniel, please," I begged, my voice small, desperate, reaching for something, anything to soften the blow. But he shook his head, his face a mask of anguish and rage. "Number you don't get to stay. You broke us. Get out." The command struck like lightning, searing through me, and I felt the ground dissolve beneath my feet. I'd lost him, lost everything, in the span of a breath. I stumbled to my feet, numb, tears blurring my vision as I grabbed my bag, my movements jerky, mechanical. He didn't speak again, just stood by the window, his back to me, his silence louder than his screams. I packed what I could, clothes, keys, fragments of a life I'd shattered, and walked out, the door slamming shut behind me with a thud that rattled my bones. The rain greeted me, indifferent, soaking through my skin as I stood on the porch, the world spinning, collapsing around me. I'd done it, told the truth, and it had cost me everything. Daniel filed for divorce days later, a swift, merciless end to what we'd built. He wouldn't see me, wouldn't hear me, and I couldn't blame him. The house, the laughter, the quiet nights, they were gone, ashes scattered by my own hands. I wandered back to my car, the rain a steady mourner, and drove into the dark, alone, the wreckage of my choices trailing behind me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. Everything had changed, and I was the one who'd broken it, all of it. Months had slipped by since I left our house, each day a quiet echo in the small apartment I'd found on the edge of Austin. The walls were bare, the rooms sparse, a bed, a table, a lamp casting weak light over a life stripped to its bones. I'd moved here to escape, to shed the memories of Daniel's rage, James's touch, the home I'd torched with my own hands. But the past clung to me, a stubborn stain seeping into every corner, whispering my mistakes in the silence. I was alone now, truly alone, and the weight of it pressed down, heavy and unyielding, a lesson carved into my skin. Nights were the hardest, the hours stretching long and empty, my thoughts a relentless tide crashing over me. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice, every glance at James, every lie to Daniel, wondering where I could have stopped, turned back. What if I'd never let it start? What if I'd chosen loyalty over longing? The questions gnawed at me, sharp and merciless, but they changed nothing. The answers were dust, and all I had left was this hollow shell of a life I'd built from the rubble. Work became my anchor, the boutique's bustle a lifeline I gripped tight. I threw myself into it, folding clothes, ringing up sales, letting the monotony numb the ache. My co-workers didn't know, didn't see the scars I carried, and I liked it that way. No pity, no judgment, just the pretense of normalcy I could wrap around myself like armor. But one evening, walking home under a drizzle that mirrored that fateful night, I stopped at a cafe, its warm glow pulling me in. I sat by the window, coffee cooling in my hands, watching raindrops slide down the glass, and felt it, a faint flicker of strength, fragile but real. I couldn't erase the past. It was a scar, permanent, etched deep, but I could choose what came next. No more running, no more hiding behind someone else's comfort. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. My pain was mine to face, my life mine to rebuild. The road ahead was uncertain, shadowed, but as I stepped back into the rain, each drop felt lighter, a quiet promise that I could start again. Hey, have you ever faced a moment where you had to pick up the pieces and start over? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If this resonated, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about life's messy, beautiful turns. Wishing you all strength to face your own storms and the courage to keep moving forward. See you in the next one. Take care.